We're here today with Veronica Jimenez and Loida Limbal. Welcome to Michigan, and thanks for joining the Global Feminisms Project and coming out here today to tell us about Sista II Sista and the grassroots organizing work you do. Welcome, Veronica.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And welcome, Loida.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to be here with you today. Let me begin by telling you what we'll be talking about during the interview. First, I'll ask you some questions about your personal histories, and then we'll talk about Sista II Sista as an organization and some of the work you do with Sista II Sista. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
So when we were talking yesterday, it was interesting to hear about how the members of Sista II Sista come from such diverse backgrounds. So maybe we can start by hearing about your own backgrounds, your personal histories, and where you were born, where you grew up, and then you can take it from there.
Okay. I was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and my family actually comes from Argentina. They migrated to Caracas way before I was born, and then they migrated to New York, all in search of a better life, all in search of trying to find some economic and political stability for their life. And so my experience moving to New York at the age of 7 was basically, I really came to politicization right away in terms of looking at comparing the United States to Venezuela and being really let down, being really upset, being really angry at my parents for having brought us, not understanding why my father would have left us to live in the United States for more than a year prior to us joining him. And, and really, I just remember being really angry and watching TV and then going to my mom and crying in her lap and asking, what are we doing here? And I think it was more about the developmental age that I was at where I started really looking at people are being shot every day. I don't remember this in Venezuela, and it was just, I was younger and I didn't see that on TV or whatever. Plus also the coldness of New York in terms of the culture, and even though there's tons of different people, I just wasn't really relating to anybody except new immigrants that lived on the block who were my age or something. And then in terms of racial understanding, my racial consciousness, I think my family, it was a big difference for me when my family moved from where a community full of new immigrants from all around the world to then my family bought a crack house, old home that was sold by the government that was to this place where it was Richmond Hill, New York, a community of mostly Guyanese and Caribbean-born immigrants, but first, second generation already. And where I had to be located to go to school, I had to be bused to a white area called Howard Beach. And it was about 2 years after they had a very dramatic episode in Howard Beach where mostly third-generation Italians who were living in America, who consider themselves Italian-American, full blood, had chased down this young African-American male down a highway, and he got run over. And it was all this thing surrounding racism and getting blacks out of their neighborhood, basically. And so my racial consciousness really became blown when I was not willing to be accepted under the Italian auspice. They were willing to say, well, since my father's last name has an Italian descendancy, they were like, well, you're Italian too. And I was like, no, I'm not Italian, I'm not Italian-American. And I related more to being Venezolana and bringing up my identity that way. And then when I went to high school, it was just real easy. I had a lot of trouble with my parents, and I chose to go to a high school far away, so I went to a high school in Brooklyn, and in Flatbush, Brooklyn, where it was real clear the dichotomy. Either you were down with the rich white Jews that lived in the upper scale part of Flatbush, or you were down with the Latinos and blacks who lived in what's known as Flatbush, more of the lower class. working class community. And so that's where really I started identifying more to African American community and participating within the African American Union that they had there, and also the Latinos Unidos group that they had there.
So what about college? Did you go to college?
Yeah, I did go to college. I was afraid of leaving New York. I had heard horror tales of what happens outside of New York in the United States. So I purposely looked for a school within New York City's boundaries, and I went to the New School for Social Research. It was a private school. It didn't look like I was going to get to go up until the week before class started because of financial aid problems. And when I did end up going, it was a shock in terms of realizing that they were really selling and promoting diversity and quote-unquote new curriculum, like touchy-feely race, class, gender curriculum. But when you really brought in your own hardcore experiences, there was conflict in the classroom. So it was okay to talk about it in theory, but when you were talking about what happens, the difference in terms of coming into Manhattan from living in Jamaica, Queens, Richmond Hill area, then there was a real problem. And then it was real obvious that they had a rotating door policy with all staff of color, which became my mentors, which became my models there. And then, so by the third year, I was totally disillusioned when they didn't rehire my mentor, Jackie Alexander, and that was about it. And it was actually around the third year when I had, my connection to Sista II Sista came around my third year when I had a white professor tell me, you should think about teaching at El Puente, because I wanted to be a teacher, a dance teacher. And I went to a school called El Puente Academy for Social Peace and Justice, and that's where I met Adwa, and I met Jenny, two of like the original co-founders or whatever. But two members who were members at Sista II Sista and started talking about Sista II Sista and asked me to perform at one of our annual fundraisers, and that's how I got introduced to Sista II Sista.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, so.
And what about for you, Loda? Can you tell us?
I have to do all that too. Oh boy. Well, I was born in Puerto Rico. Both of my parents are from the Dominican Republic. And I came to New York when I was about 3 years old with my mother and my aunt. And we first came to the South Bronx. Then from the South Bronx, we moved to Harlem. Then from Harlem, we moved to Washington Heights, back to Harlem, back to the South Bronx. I really have lived like uptown, you know, I'm like a uptown New York girl through and through. And I think, you know, in terms of just, you know, becoming involved in community work and social justice work, I think pretty similar to Veronica, it was through the different experiences that I went through. My mother didn't speak English, and so a lot of times I would have to translate for her in all kinds of circumstances. And I remember one time I went to the unemployment office with her, and you know, just seeing how impatient people were with like the fact that, like, you know, they had to talk to this immigrant woman who doesn't speak English, and I really have to end up talking to like a 7-year-old, you know, 8-year-old kid, and just being really impatient with that. And I felt like really treating her like she was just dumb, you know, like being disrespectful to her, which for me was hard to see because I really looked up to my mom. Like, I was a little kid. You look up to your moms. You don't really want to see people talking down to your mother, you know. A lot of those types of experiences, you know, the first time I got called a nigger, you know, on the street, Midtown Manhattan, you know, like New York is supposed to be whatever, you know. The
melting pot.
Yeah, there's everybody and everything. And, you know, I'm walking down. It was like on 50-something Street, and it was raining. This short Jewish man had a big, big umbrella, and we were walking, and like he walked past me and almost hit me with his umbrella. I have to duck, but somehow, or for some reason, he was upset at me or something, you know, and just like stopped and was like, nigger, you know, and just kind of like was really ill about it, you know. And I was young. I remember kind of like standing there and being like, what just happened, you know? Like, it was like a normal day. I was doing normal things. I didn't have a comeback or anything, you know, because I was just kind of like,
Going for a loop.
you know, just like a bunch of different experiences that, you know, I remember seeing that the Eyes on the Prize series also when I was really young, and like seeing all those images, you know, black folks being like beat and hosed down and everything. Like, just a lot of stuff made me, all together with my experience, made me just start questioning things that I saw around me. I remember my uncle had just come from the Dominican Republic, and I guess somebody had done something in our neighborhood, and they were looking for a tall black dude, right? And my uncle fit that description. He was a tall black dude, you know? And I was coming home from school, mad people are around, the cops have my uncle like up against the wall, you know, on this like fence. His face is like all pressed up into the bars of the fence and everything, you know, and all this commotion. And they're looking for this person, and the description, like when you really looked at the description, it didn't have anything to do with my uncle. My uncle had just gotten here, didn't speak English, nothing, you know, was just like, welcome to America, you know, was his like welcoming wagon or whatever. And just all those things of seeing all those kinds of injustices, which at the time I didn't see as injustice, but I just saw as like not good, not right. Why does it have to be like this? Why are all the buildings in my neighborhood burnt down? And when you go to downtown Manhattan, it's like the sidewalks are huge and really clean, and there's doormen, and you know, and all these kinds of like questions started coming up. And slowly but surely, you know, you kind of, somebody comes by and tells you something that sparks your interest, you know, at a certain point in your life, and you're like, oh, you know, let me go check that out. And so I began being involved in community work through that, kind of wanting to understand and wanting to talk to people that were talking about why things were the way that they were in our neighborhoods and stuff. So that's a little bit of my history stuff.
Thanks. So in a way, you answered the question about what brought you into organizing. So maybe we can shift to a discussion about Sista II Sista. It was beautiful last night when Veronica was talking about how she talked about Sista II Sista as her heart and soul. So maybe I can ask you to go into some of what is Sista II Sista? Let's start there.
Well, Sista II Sista, I'm going to share a little bit about the history of Sista II Sista. Sista II Sista basically came together in 1996 when a circle of women really started discussing the reality that there was no real space for young women of color in particular. If you went to a community organization or cultural organization, then youth organizing wasn't really a topic, wasn't something central, wasn't something to be discussed. If you went to a youth organization, then women's issues wasn't central, didn't even fit in the scope of their discussion. And if you went to a women's organization, youth was last.
Women of color, working class women of color wasn't at the center. So
yeah, so that's basically where Sista II Sista came to in terms of.
I think too, just to add, there was a bunch of people were at a Black student leadership conference or something like that.
It was out in the West somewhere.
I'm getting the title wrong, and they were sitting there, and there was all these like workshops and panels and things talking about young Black and Latino men, like the experience of young Black and Latino men in urban centers in the inner city, really talking about young men as like this kind of endangered species because there's all this stuff coming at them, and you know, police brutality and all of these things and gangs and blah blah blah. And they were kind of like, yo, but there's like a whole lot of young Black and Latina women like this nobody's talking about. Like, what about their experiences? What about the things that they go through? You know, from there coming back and being like, yo, there really isn't a space that's focused on us, you know, for us to be able to share our experiences and to kind of think of, you know, of like what we would like things to look like, what we would like, you know, how we would like things to be different and how we could do that, you know. And so that was kind of like it was partly a reaction, you know, to the lack of spaces, but also I think envisioned as a place where, you know, women could come together to collectively do things, you know. Young women of color could collectively do things.
And when was that early period?
It was 95, 96.
95, 96. And so what happened then? I mean, how was it formed?
Well, originally the group of women of color started discussing the need to have something, a space for the holistic development of young women, for young women, and by young women. And so originally what came out of that was the idea of having a program, an annual program that came together in the summer. And it was all by volunteer effort and time. And that was the beginning of the Freedom School for young women of color. It originated as like a summer event that, you know, people pulled together out of any and all resources they could, you know, catching a couple extra books from the high schools where they were teaching, or bringing in some material, and just starting to start the discussion basing on the histories of radical women of color, getting that was one of the major topics, revolutionary women in history of color, right? And so looking at that, and then it just sort of developed. I'm not sure when it was that we started the discussion of not reproducing some of the power dynamics that currently exist, because that there was a shift, in our own organization.
I think too about that was like every summer it was done in like a different place, you know, because we would borrow space from people. So one summer we used like a church space, one summer we used a school space, like other organization spaces. And I think too that whole idea with the Freedom School, why, you know, it got named the Freedom School, was in the tradition of the Freedom Schools that happened down south during the Civil Rights Movement and all that, you know, that time period of like a way to do political education work with people and then be able to take action with people. So, you know, just to kind of add that. And at one point when it started, it wasn't a collective. And like Veronica was saying, it was totally, you know, people volunteer. A few people were teachers at the time. Some other people were like just doing other things.
Independent, whatever.
So the summer times, and I think it was like this setup of like there was like a core committee, and then there were other folks, you know, who were like volunteers or something like that, and through a lot of discussion and a lot of like growing pains, because I know that process was really painful. I wasn't around for it then, but I hear the stories that it was a painful process to go through, because it involved like checking people on like their power tripping, and you know, why does this have to be like this, and why does this have to be like that? And some people left, some people stayed, you know, new people came in. And that's when the decision to become a collective really happened, and to be a collective that would function on a consensus base, you know. So really like trying to create something where everyone's voice was equally important, you know, and equally valued, because we had, you know, we had exactly come from a space of being in other places and other spaces where our voices weren't valued because either we were young, or because we were women, or because we were young women of color altogether, or whatever, you know. So we were like, we can't just keep doing that, you know. We can't just keep reproducing it. So that's where the whole collective, which for us is something that is really important and we talk about a lot, because we see that in that. You know, a lot of times people are talking about, when they're talking about community organizing, they're talking about, you know, you have an issue that you're working on, right? And so you come up with a campaign and you have a victory and you don't have a victory, and it's kind of like really product oriented, like what's the end goal type of thing. Even though the whole time that you're working, you know, there could be like, you know, mad issues and different dynamics that are oppressive and silencing to people, but it doesn't matter so long as we get like the victory over there, you know?
Which is usually aimed at a reform, right? Which is usually aimed at
of an institution or something. Whereas for us, the process of how we work is really important, you know? Like for us, it's not going to be meaningful, you know, to say, for example, get 38 new translators in a welfare center, and that be our victory if the whole way through, you know, all the women that don't speak English don't have equal say in the campaign and the work because they don't speak English and we don't care. You know what I'm saying? Like, so for us, it's really, you know, the whole collective thing is more than even a structural thing. It's like what we're about, you know, what we believe in.
So the collective is kind of a non-hierarchical group of people who run the organization, and is it people from different age groups? Could you tell us more about the collective?
Yeah, well, the collective is, all of Sista II Sista is intergenerational, and the collective is also intergenerational, but we noticed because the collective ends up taking on most of the administrative, hardcore, like
Boring work?
Yeah, the boring work, that it wasn't really attractive to all of our younger sister members, right? And also, I'd like to say something that I meant to say earlier, which is usually we wouldn't be here, 2 adult members, collective members representing Sista II Sista. This is also a configuration that we're not very comfortable with, because it's always been important for us to make sure that the young woman's voice is represented through her, like by her own speaking, you know, through her presence. And because of the dates in which our
Thursday and a Friday, you know, high school students are in high school. They're in school
there's
right
no
now.
way that they could miss 2 days. And
So
so
because the interview took place on a Thursday or Friday,
it's so
the
far
younger
away.
girls couldn't come.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that if the questions were being thrown through a younger sister, I'm sure they would be saying it, you know, answering it through their eyes. And so in that way, but to bring it back to the collective, once we started realizing that even though we were inviting and trying to schedule it around their schedules, the meetings, that 2-3 hour meetings once a month weren't interesting and fun and people weren't coming, then we had to really hold ourselves accountable to us saying we want everyone to be part of the decision-making process. And so that's where we discussed the idea of creating squads, which is another
Body.
Yeah, it's another body of younger sisters coming together and participating within the program of our organization, within the structure, you know. And so that's basically
And we have a board too.
board
can't
too,
forget,
we have a
which is
board.
an advisory board.
Yeah, they don't have like decision making. I mean, they have decision making power, but it's not usually like how most boards function or whatever. And the squads, they really like kind of lead most of the programmatic work of the organization. So they've gone through, it's like normally young women that have gone through the Freedom School program, have finished like a cycle of the Freedom School, then go through training, and then are like stipended to be able to be around, you know, Sista II Sista more, to be able to take on kind of, you know, facilitation of workshops and developing curriculum for other young women their ages, and to really be leading the community organizing work, choosing the issues, thinking about the strategies and stuff like that. And the squads too, with the whole thing of being stipended, was something that was really, we had to really think about, because one of the issues that's very real is that young women in our communities either have to work after school or have to take care of a younger sibling. So participation of young women in, you know, in something like this sometimes isn't valued by like family, you know, or just they just can't do it, you know, financially they can't do it or whatever. And so, you know, there's like a lot of things that, you know, I think, and it's a conversation that I've had with some other folks, is like, you know, women-only spaces and stuff for young women, I think is really different than creating stuff just for young men, you know, young men-only spaces, because I feel like there's so much more pressure on young women to have a different kind of responsibility within their homes than there is for young men, you know, which kind of makes like, you know, that their participation that much harder, you know, in something that's outside of the home, you know. At least I feel that way in our communities, you know.
Well, this is a perfect transition to go into some of the projects, since you started talking about the programmatics. So maybe I can ask you to tell us a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on.
Well, I can discuss a little bit about our current organizing project, which is Sista Liberated Ground, and much like Loida was mentioning about us, about it not being goal-oriented strictly. It's very much about the process, just like the collective and the squads. If we need to create another function, like now it's important for us to find to better incorporate youth that are passing out of the squads and into the collective or into more of the staff. So we've created a new youth staff position. With our SLG work, it's also about the process. What we think, like we've already addressed through a video, you have the right to break the silence, and through 2 seasons amount of work, like the reality of police harassment on young women of color in particular within our own communities. We also realize that when there's domestic abuse or familial abuse, calling the police is not really going to solve our issues. And we don't think that domestic abuse is a woman's issue. You know, we think of it more as it affects everybody. If we were to call the police, or if a sister is to be killed, like one sister was fighting with her mother by a police officer, it affects the whole family, it affects the whole community, it reverberates throughout the block, throughout the neighborhood, and it affects all of our safety. And so we look at Sista Liberated Ground as a community effort, as a community work. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to change the culture of violence that currently exists within ourselves, within interpersonal relationships, within our families, and throughout the community. So the ways in which SLG is trying to affect that culture is by, one, doing cultural events, doing hardcore propaganda stating that violence will no longer be tolerated within a designated zone, and 2, by promoting discussion. We're having like what we call sister circles, which are more like forums for us to throw out issues and discuss it and try to hold one another accountable on, if we say we're not gonna, you know, we're not tolerating violence, then what's up with somebody just yelled at you? You just yelled at somebody back. What's going on? You know, you hit your little sister. Why? You know. Then we also have an action line, which is a way for all community members and all interested people to find out how they can be involved. And we also have, what am I missing? Sister circles, action line, propaganda, and
there's something else. There's 4 things. Oh.
I'm blanking out the light. No.
Sister circles.
Workshops and trainings. There we go. How can we forget? Workshops and trainings, which is a space for us to practice. To practice how self-defense, personal self-defense, collective self-defense, a variety.
Whatever, you know, folks in the community identify. Like we had a couple of community meetings with different women from the immediate area where we're at, and you know, people brought up, like, you know, we want a workshop on this, or we would want a workshop on that, or
we want to know how to use mace. We want to, like, whatever.
So who comes? Who comes to these workshops? Who are the people who participate?
Initially, when we were doing the community meetings, to even just start talking about the idea of creating a Sisters Liberated Ground, it was intergenerational, right? There was like some teenage women and then some like older women,
mostly,
you know,
recent immigrants.
Mostly recent immigrants with their children and stuff. With, you know, what comes. So it was like a really crazy mix of people, because like you know, like a 15-year-old's energy, and then you have like a 45-year-old mother of 3 who just got off of work, and but you know, got into the conversation, got into the dialogues. But we've decided now with SLG to focus it really first on young women and not adult women, just because we found that with the issue of violence, adult women are much more vocal in identifying that as a problem for themselves and talking about their stories and kind of just taking over space, you know, which would mean that younger women wouldn't talk about, oh, this is going on with my boyfriend, or oh, this is going on with my girlfriend, or oh, this is happening with my brother or my uncle or whatever. And so, you know, since this is something new, it's like very different. There's not that many models for, you know, kind of community accountability stuff around violence against women. We're like, well, let's try to focus first on young women and keep it sort of, you know, keep a narrower view, and then, you know, see how it goes and see, you know, just because it's like when you talk about violence, even when you don't talk about violence. I remember one time going, you know, it was during the Freedom School, and on Saturdays after the Saturday workshops, we have like a big meal with everyone and just kind of hang out and chill and stuff. And I had gone to like one of the local Dominican restaurants to pick up the food that we were gonna have. And this woman, like, you know, like makes me, you know, she's like motions and she's like, you know, come closer. And I go to her and she's like, oh, you know, what's that Sista II Sista place? You know, it's something for women, right? And I'm like, yeah, you know, we work with young women, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, because I'm having problems with my husband, you know, and I need some help, you know. So I hadn't even said anything about violence, you know, and it's like the response is really overwhelming because unfortunately it's so common, right? That so many women are going through violence in our communities. So because of all of that, you know, and I think too, we found just like younger women it's a little bit harder, or I don't really know what it is, you know. I wish like a 15-year-old young woman was here to say, but, you know, to identify violence as an issue, people will talk about other things, you know. But especially like interpersonal violence or family violence or relationship violence. Whereas an adult woman will talk about her partner being abusive, a younger woman doesn't tend to so easily talk about a partner being abusive. And so because of that, we were like, okay, let's focus in over here. So that's really who we're, you know, to answer your question,
no,
like
that's really
4 hours later.
Not at all. Every piece that you said was really helpful, and I learned a great deal about the work in concrete ways. So your name is Sista II Sista. The name of your organization is Sista II Sista. You work with women and young women, adult women, but I haven't heard you use the term feminist. So I'm going to provoke you here and ask you to, what do you think of the term? Do you use it? Do you have a position on it?
Well, I personally don't use the word feminist or the word activist to describe my work or myself. And I think it's partly the reality that in the United States, what those two words conjure up for me are middle to upper class white people, and when it comes to feminist women, you know, throwing off the shackles of patriarchy here in the United States and rising up and saying I want to vote, and so that's not me, and I don't relate to that history, and so I don't use either of those terms.
What about for you, Lloyd?
Yeah, I'm not no feminist. You know. I mean, I don't even, you know, like we were talking last night, and Vito was like, I'd rather use the word organizer than the word activist and all these things. For me, like all this work, I don't really name it nothing. You know, it's just like, it's just what I have to do. You know, it's just my responsibility. You know, like I want things to be better and different for people in my community. That's it, point blank. You know, and it's not just for women, you know, it's for my community, you know. I'm specifically choosing to work with women because I'm a woman, and I think we all have different experiences within our community, you know. But it's not under like any like word, you know, or I don't know, whatever like those categories are, you know. It's just what I have to do, you know. I just see it as like my responsibility, you know, like you see it, you don't like it, you can't just sit around and complain about it. You got to try to do something to change it, point blank, you know.
So you don't see your work as, you know, feminist work?
I would never call my work feminist work. It's just like, I don't relate at all to that word, like feminist. Like it's just, and not even like in a, you know, making a point to not use it. It's just not even in my head. It's not part of my vocabulary even, you know, like. And it's like it's definitely not in the vocabulary of any of the young women that we work with. It's not
part of our reality, right?
Yeah,
it's not like, and I think also, like, at least from what I've seen in the group, in the collective, has been sort of like, that is more of like on a theoretical, like what you might see in universities, trying to describe to other people in big fancy words what we do. And it's more like, why should we even address or respond or, you know, like play within that little configuration? It's not necessary. And that's, I know, at least for me, in terms of activists, that's definitely what it conjures up, like somebody who has extra time on their hands, so that's why, you know, and they feel guilty or whatever, and that's what they do, and it's not, doesn't come from like a necessity, like, no, we need to do this, and it's just second nature, like breathing, you know.
It's funny, that whole feminist thing, man. Now y'all got me thinking about it, like why, you know, like why is it? Because yeah, you know, you're working with women and all of that, but I think it's what Veronica was saying, it's like, I don't know, for whatever reasons, I've never studied the history of it or anything, right? But I'm sure there's a bunch of reasons for like why a whole lot of people don't identify with feminism or the word feminist or any of that. It's like something that's become, you know, it's kind of like how your appendix, you know, how like it's like an organ that you have, but you don't really need, and it can be taken out, and so, you know, people don't really think about it anymore. You know how things become kind of useless almost, or a non-issue after time, you know, like, it's like I wonder about our pinkies, what we really do with our pinkies, you know. But I think there must be reasons for why it's become such a non-factor for a lot of people, to the point where it's not, because I think at one point women of color in the U.S. were really trying to respond to the idea of feminism and to mainstream like white women's feminism, and came up with like terms like womanism and all these other things, right? And I feel like with our generation of folks, or at least the people that I'm around, we're not even trying to respond, you know, we just don't even engage it, you know, because it's just a non-issue, you know, for us or something.
Well, thanks for, you know, your feedback on that one. It was really interesting.
I don't know about the appendix, but I was just trying to say, like.
Another thing I thought was interesting from last night's conversation was you had a perspective, both of you, that September 11th wasn't the dividing line of history, you know, in the way that it gets presented to us sometimes in the corporate media. I agree with you, but at the same time, you know, it'd be interesting to hear about whether the issues that you work on that impact young women, women of color, immigrant communities have shifted after September 11th in New York City.
I think from my perspective, I think we all see that kind of differently, but from my perspective, the issues themselves haven't really changed all that much, you know, at least for us in terms of the work that we're doing around women and violence, you know, against women of color. Like, it was violence before, it's still violence, it's still interpersonal, it's still happening all over the place. Nobody talks about it, you know, it's not seen as a community issue. It's not really dealt with within the social justice movement. So none of that has really changed for us, right? But what has changed is the climate that we're working within, you know, because I feel like so many things that that were kind of achieved by folks prior to 9/11, right? Like, you know, we were talking about, you know, New York City stuff, and during the Giuliani period, you know, people, I feel like, were so aware, you know, and like had become politicized around how messed up Giuliani was, you know, because he messed with like every segment of the population, from like the average brother that's like, you know, selling drugs on a corner, to like your 85-year-old, you know, grandmother on a bus complaining about how Giuliani is like cutting this and cutting that, to your city university student, to your street vendor, to your taxi driver. Like, everybody got screwed over by Giuliani, and it was like everybody knew that, you know, and people were talking about it. It was very like out in public space, at least in our communities. You know, I don't know about all of New York City, but people talked about Giuliani all the time. People was cursing him out on the regular, you know, which is great, you know, because people were like engaged in politics and thinking about stuff, and you know, and I think too, like in New York City, the anti-police brutality movement, you know, was really strong to the point where like everybody, you know, would talk about how, you know, the cops is so much misconduct and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And like those things got undone by 9/11, you know, like Giuliani went out of office as a hero. He was a hero. He saved people's lives. Wow, he was so great. He was like ground zero. And I'm not trying to be like not sympathetic, right? Because a lot of people died, and that's never good. That's never like a pretty thing, you know, to see people's like sorrow. But it undid so many things, you know. The police were heroes. You know, like God forbid that you question the police now, you know. So I think what has changed is the climate, you know, and I feel like 9/11 shut down a lot of doors that have been opened up, you know, in terms of being able to talk to people about different issues, you know, like people kind of shut down, like, nah, Giuliani's a hero, nah, the police are great, you know, they save people's lives. And so I think that really changed in New York City after 9/11, and not necessarily so much, you know, of the issues in terms of our Sista II Sista work. I think for other folks, you know, like immigrant rights stuff, I think has changed a lot, you know, so I think other segments of the population have definitely been affected in different ways, you know, but in terms of violence against women, 9/11 is not like the beginning of history or anything for us, you know.
Yeah, and I think also, to me, what I really, really noticed is the way in which now the police can basically do whatever they want. And I do think that it's getting to the point where more people are talking about it, right? Like, more people are like, now it's an offense to not stop while you're driving when you see a police officer, like, right away, like, like they can give you a ticket for anything. You swipe, you pass, and something happens on the metro, and they can arrest you for something as simple as, you know, not going back and swiping again. They can arrest you for swiping somebody in for free. They can arrest you for anything they want at any time. It doesn't matter what you
can't question them.
Yeah,
know,
at all. And I think that in our communities, that was being discussed prior to 9/11. Like, it was being discussed that that New York City was becoming a police state prior to 9/11. But then once 9/11 happened, it was like, now it has to be a police state. This is a security threat.
Right,
now they
safety.
Yeah. Now it's not racial profiling when they stop every black man in the car. Now it's security. Now if you're riding a bus, what we got to worry about taking young women on a retreat, because they're gonna stop us, and they're gonna want to take everything out, and they're gonna want to look through everything, and it just gives more chance for more things to happen. And so that's really what I see in terms of the work that Sista II Sista does and how New York has changed.
And there's a climate too of kind of like, that like the Patriot Acts got passed or whatever, and that they really do now have so many more rights and so much more leeway to pry and to harass and to do all kinds of things, right, into people's lives. And I think within at least people that are doing community work in New York City, there is like a level of paranoia, because, you know, and there's been incidences, you know, where like some of our allies' offices have been broken into, and like nothing gets stolen but their like main server computer or something, you know, that has
Or how about the instance that happened to us, like the day of our first community meeting for SLG, we had this huge big police van just chilling outside, and like that's the time that community members are supposed to be coming to discuss how we don't need to, you know, go to the police.
They were stationed in front of our front of our office for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It was like a mobile unit, you know. So just like a lot of extra, different things have created
hostility
and paranoia. So I think that has also really changed, like the climate in which people are doing work. People are much more like, oh, we got to be more careful, you know, like we got to be more sort of aware of, you know, what we're saying, who we're saying it to, how we're doing things, where we're going, you know.
You got to keep track of your emails, or somehow your email got to somebody else. I didn't send that. How did that happen?
You know, like we can't, you know, got to be more careful in what we involve young women under the age of 18, because the likelihood of being arrested is higher. We got to be really aware of what we involve folks in our communities that are undocumented, because they can't really afford to be arrested, you know. And so there's like all these extra kind of precautions and things that you got to think about post 9/11 that I think are really real and have changed.
So you've been talking about local issues, you know. Is there a commitment to linking local issues to global issues? Has Sista II Sista done kind of global, local kind of work?
Yeah, we had at one point a solidarity work team, which was really geared at, I mean, I think, like, again, what we were saying, you know, right now, like, it's Loida and Veronica talking, and we're giving kind of our perspective on stuff, but there's a lot of different, really different women within Sista II Sista. And I think one of the things is that really shines through is that different folks have really strong connections to different third world countries, either because they're from there or because of, you know, a family or a friend or whatever, or work, you know. So people have connections to, like, everywhere from Mexico to, like, Chile to Brazil
to Tanzania to South Africa.
Yeah, you know, and Guyana, like all over the place, right? Because we are from all over the place. And through that, there's been, you know, prior to even it becoming an organizational thing of having a solidarity work team really geared towards doing solidarity work with women in the third world. Even prior to that, there was, like, informally, you know, you would go and you knew that there was a cooperative of women in Chiapas making, you know, blusas or whatever. You buy it at their ideal price, you know, what they would ideally want. You know, you come back and sell it here, a portion of what you make stays to your organization, goes back to theirs, economic solidarity, a bunch of different things. But then we did the solidarity work team, which was the young women had heard about all the stuff that was happening in Juarez, Mexico, with the disappearances of all the young women, their ages, you know. And they were like, oh, that's crazy messed up, and nobody's doing nothing about it. And so on the International Juarez Solidarity Day, back in November a while ago, they organized an action in front of the Mexican embassy in New York City and, you know, did a bunch of stuff, got petitions. And then right after that, the whole war stuff against Iraq started. So they turned their attention to doing anti-war work, you know, in solidarity, you know, with folks over in Iraq.
And we also hosted a Palestinian sister coming in, right, and speaking with the solidarity team. Like, any chance that we get, we do it
to make the connections, right? Because it is all really connected. You know?
Right. Plus, also, we feel that we take inspiration and we look at models from the third world. That's all we like. Those are our roots. That's what we're working towards. That's what, you know, we see as important. And also, we can't deny or forget to mention the fact that we've had Sista II Sista members go to the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, the last 2 social forums in Brazil, Porto Alegre. So, like, just different places where it's very important for us to maintain and build connections and bring it back and share that with the rest of the world.
I think, too, like, recognizing that as people of color within the United States, and this is me, this is like my personal tangent, you know, but I feel like as people of color that live within the United States, the analogy that I make is that was made for me by this older dude one time, this older white dude one time. I was really young and I was in some bookstore or something, and I was asking him, like, well, this stuff is so, like, threatening to the system and so revolutionary, like, why can't we even buy it? Like, why do we even have access to it, you know? And his analogy was, like, you know, the United States is like, he made the analogy to slavery times, right? And he was like, you know, think of the difference between the conditions that a house slave lives in and a field slave, right? House slave, you have some more kind of, like, amenities and, you know, blah, 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 and a little bit more comfort and a little bit more cushioning, right? And so you can get caught up in it and get lost in it, you know? Whereas the field slave is a lot more clear, you know, and, you know, pretty, like, direct that it can't get any worse than this, you know? Which is the conditions that today, you know, exist in a lot of third world countries, you know? So I feel like as people within the United States, you know, I think we have, like, a very specific role, a very particular role that we need to be playing in terms of solidarity with, you know, our brothers and sisters that are in the third world. You know, because we are living within the nation that is, like, has a huge hand and maintaining the conditions that exist in the third world, you know, and like as people that kind of benefit from the comforts and the things, you know, that we have here. Like, we have that responsibility to, you know, acknowledge that privilege and also to be responsible about it, you know, to be in solidarity with. So, you know, and I think it's something that, you know, I'm going to venture out and say, I think it's something that a lot of folks within Sista II Sista, like, feel that way, you know. So there is a lot of consciousness around international solidarity and things like that.
But also, I think specifically in terms of working class, like solidarity, because I think that it's not a coincidence that, you know, we're mostly working class sisters of color and Sista II Sista, and we're not really showing solidarity with the daughters of the owners of global television or you know, or the king of Sudan, you know, where we're working more like in solidarity with working class folks, you know, or people who are even under that category. So,
well, I know you know that we have a live audience here with us, so we have a few minutes left, so maybe we can turn to them and see if they have any questions before we wrap up. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
After you dropped all this knowledge on me, give them a chance to jump in. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a very basic question. First of all, thank you so much. It's been really interesting, and I'm surprised at how fast the time went. And I have like a basic question in terms of outreach. First of all, what is your space like, and what is it sort of, if you can describe it? I'm really interested to think about what this space might be like. And also, do you have a website?
good.
We have, our space right now is 3 kind of small storefronts that are all connected, you know, and so we have the first room is kind of like, it looks like a living room. It's like a chill space where we have like meals together and stuff. The middle room is pretty emptied out because that's where we do workshops that can be like anything from like dance workshops to, you know, more like political education workshops. So for whatever we need to be able to move it around, we kind of keep it emptied out. And then the third space is our office, which is just like an open office, has like a few computers, and people just get on whatever computer is open at the time and do their work. And then outreach, what we do for outreach is our main way of doing outreach is going to high schools, local high schools, in Bushwick, but now also in other parts of Brooklyn. And what we try to do is get into, like, they normally have advisory periods in the morning, and so, you know, try to like talk to the principal or whoever, you know, if there's like a cool teacher that's like, oh yeah, I want you to come in and talk to my kids, you know, and do presentations, do outreach presentations, give folks information, how they can get involved, do a lot of cultural events, block parties and stuff. That's like a really good time to do outreach, go to group homes, do street outreach at local like hangout spots at a movie theater or pizza shop or whatever, you know, and just do a lot of it, you know, because some people will listen, some people won't, some people will be interested, some people won't. So that's pretty much like our outreach strategy, though, is street outreach and high school
On
outreach.
the field.
Yeah. And our website is www.SistaIISista.org.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add, because you can't forget it about our office, is that it's bright. It's brighter than I am.
Yes, it's really bright.
Yeah?
Super duper bright.
We
Well,
all
not
made
all
a
the
collective
rooms are
thing.
bright.
Well,
Not all
the
the
first
rooms.
2. No, I mean the last 2, right?
Yeah, like they're all like, it's crazy colors, basically. Some of them are bright, some of them are like earthy kind of colors, but it's like everybody got up in there with their hands and it's all over the place.
Yeah.
I actually also had a couple questions. It was really wonderful to listen to you talk about Sista II Sista, and I wondered if you could tell us, you mentioned that you'd won an award, what that was for, what work that was for in New York, and also what sort of specific coalitions you've been a part of that might give us a little better sense of what kind of issues you deal with outside of the types of things you've talked about. And then if I could squeeze in another one, I was very intrigued by, and you didn't have time to talk about, You talked about how, I think Nadine mentioned in the beginning, the mission statement, and liberation and love were sort of put together. And that's really evocative for me, and I wonder if you could talk about what you think, what you mean by that, sort of as a philosophy or as an organizing principle in the work that you do.
Okay, so the first question was...
What was the award for?
Oh, it was for the Freedom School program. For the Freedom School, yeah. So it was just for doing that work. It's like a recognition. The Union Square Awards pretty much recognizes, individual folks or group of folks that are doing, I think what they call like innovative, community work or something like that, or really important community work. So that's what it was for. It was for doing the workshops. It was in
2000?
99, 2000?
99, 2000.
We have bad memories. I'm sorry.
We can't even say we weren't around then. It's just our memories.
We just have bad memories.
So the second one was about the coalitions. And we actually have another plaque from one of the when the coalition won the Coalition Against Police Brutality. And that's one of our major ones, which are all citywide organizations. I mean, city-based organizations, all people of color, right? People of color led and run organizations working, doing considerable amount of work surrounding police brutality and combating it. And our second coalition that we do a lot of work with is Third World Within. And Third World Within, again, is another coalition of organizations that are led and run by people of color throughout the city, all working on a variety of issues, everything from immigrant rights to community-specific issues, to workers' rights, we have everything in Third World Within. And most of our work originally, actually our work with Third World Within was brought together around the World's
Conference Against Racism.
Yep, the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, and the importance of having people of color from the United States present the work that we're doing here instead of white people going over there representing the work that they do there, even if it's within our communities. And then, but it was so crazy because returning, I didn't even get to return before September 11th. So it was like 3, 4, 5 days before September 11th, 2001. And then we didn't even get a real chance to do a report back because it was so much in response to this crazy propaganda machine that started after September 11th. And then most of our work has been surrounding anti-war initiatives as a coalition.
But really, I mean, I think that the thing with TWW and the anti-war work that we were focused on doing was really bringing in like a justice analysis to the anti-war movement in New York City that was totally missing, and connecting the war abroad to the war at home and making those connections that, the larger anti-war movement wasn't making. And so that's really like what we focused on. We did a few events, we did a cultural event, we did some rallies, we participated. We did a people of color mobilization during the February 15th large mobilization in New York City.
Which I just wanted to add about the February 15th is I don't think that most of the rest of the United States or the rest of the world really knew how many people really got to the streets that day because they refused to do a panoramic, but there were tons of people there present. And then after that, we did
May 19th, on Malcolm X's birthday.
Registration.
We did it was a campaign called Weapons of Mass Resistance. And it was just the idea of like really countering, coming up with strong like messages and getting propaganda out into our communities and stuff, just to counter like the message that they were starting to put out that the war was over, that the war was won, like, to be like, no, it's really not over, it's really only gonna get worse, like don't believe the hype. Did anti-recruitment work locally in Bushwick,
we did that, but the rest of TWW did in their own communities too,
or
right?
Different groups did different things within their community, but the goal was really of that campaign was to do anti-war work in your local community, as opposed to mobilizing to bring people to Manhattan for like big, you know, white-led kind of marches, you know, like really go back to your own communities and build with folks on the street level. And I think the overall thing about TWW that I think is really good and that is interesting is that it's like us trying to be in solidarity with each other, you know? And so, you know, say for example, when Drum, Daisy's Up and Rising, was doing their series of rallies against the special registration at the INS, like they could call on us and be like, yo, we need 2 more people to come do security, we need somebody else to do this, we need somebody else to do that. And also as a way for us to educate our own communities about each other's issues, right? Because there's a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding and discrimination and a whole lot of things, right, that lead people of color to not interact in a good way, right? Even though we sometimes share the same communities, there's a lot of prejudices and a lot of misinformation. A lot of times we'll all believe of each other what the mainstream media is telling us of, you know, each other one or whatever. So we also kind of see TWW as an opportunity and a way for us to be learning more about each other's issues, right? And so all this backlash against Arab folks and South Asian folks, you know, this is like a moment that us that are working in Black and Latino communities can, you know, do some education around, some political education. Like what is the difference between Palestine and Pakistan, you know, like, and not nowhere near each other. I mean, you know, we laugh, but it's just real because people are watching television. That's where they're getting their information, and that's what the television is telling us, you know. And I think that's one of the things that's really kind of special about the TWW thing is that it gives us a chance to work on intra people of color stuff, which I think is really important and not always necessarily be focused on responding to a larger white something or other, you know.
And then she had the question about liberation and love.
Oh, liberation and love. That was like the flower children part of somebody.
Which you came up with.
No, that wasn't me. That wasn't me. It wasn't me.
So who was it?
I was somebody there. We just redid our mission last October, just because we thought there was a lot of language in there that wasn't direct and you didn't really know what it meant, you know. We were like,
it's too long.
Like, what is this mission for? Like, who the hell can understand this? Who can read this, you know? And also like a couple of other, you know, shifts of, instead of saying young women of color in this broad sense, saying specifically Black and Latina young women, because that's who we've always been, that's who we've always worked with, so why not be just specific about that, you know, and the communities that we're particularly dealing with. And then also because young women of color, like, you know, a lot of times you have to translate stuff into Spanish, and the whole people of color thing is not translatable, like, into a lot of languages. It doesn't make any sense when you put it into another language. And so we were like, you know, for a bunch of reasons, started revisiting the mission and the language of it and everything. And the liberation and love thing was like, we were just like, well, what do we want? Like, we want people to treat each other with love, and we want people to feel free, you know, and like free from like oppression and stuff. So we were just like,
we need liberation, so that's
liberation,
what we want.
Yeah, we want our people to be free, you know. And so I think that's where the liberation part of it came in, and I think the love part, you know,
it's just that the
trying to like revalue that, you know, because I think like ideas, really basic sentiments of like love and caring and things like that, we sometimes take them out so much of political stuff because they sound kind of mushy or whatever. But it's really like, you know, good values, things that you like would want. You know, you would want people to treat each other with love and to value life, you know, like at the end of the day. So I think that's our liberation and love trip.
Well, I know I've been really inspired. I'm ready to get out there and start working after this. We are deeply, deeply grateful for you two coming out here and sharing with us all this knowledge and teaching us about everything you do. And this, you know, big thanks goes out to you.
Thank you for having us. Yes. It's cool. It wasn't that bad. I was scared at first, but it's okay.
And if anybody else wants to contact us, you have our website, right? So please do it.
Thank you.
Bow to no man's word. Why even freedom and not rest. We here believe in freedom and not rest until it comes. Bum bum ba dum bum 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 bum.